There we go. Hello. Got it. All right. Hello. Welcome. It's crazy. All right. Welcome to the AP African American Studies live stream. I'm Malcolm Reed, and my guest, uh, my co-host, Marsha Greco is here with me. Hello. Welcome. Oh, I got to turn down my sound. AP African American Studies live. Oh God. I'm Malcolm Rookie. Host. Her co-host. Marsha Greco is here. African American Studies live. Okay, we yapping. Oh, rookie. Oh,
All right, are you good?
rookie. I think I got it down now.
All right,
Oops.
are you good?
Yep, I think so. I think I got it down now. Nope, I don't.
All right, are you good?
Yep, I think so. Where's the sound coming from? Nope, I don't. Okay, I fixed it. There was like all these tabs coming from different places. So uh like I was saying, Malcolm Reed, Marsha Greco, we're here to just talk a little bit about this exam and go over some things. The test is Tuesday. Um, I've probably been studying for it as much as I'm like, as much like I'm gonna take the test myself. So, I wanted to just say some things about what I think we need to do to prepare. And, for my students personally, I know that some of y'all might be on here. So welcome. I'm glad you are taking some time out of your day and for everyone else to do the same. Um, hopefully that you can have some takeaways and things that you can learn from here that are some questions that get answered, or maybe you are able some other questions that you might not have even thought about come up, and you can start to think about different ways to review some of this content. It is a lot, and the test is not probably not going to be easy. This AP world is mostly new to me. This is year 2 for me, so playing around with this type of review should offer me an opportunity to grow as well. So that's why we're here. Marsha, you want to say a few words before we get into it?
Yes, hello. My name is Marsha Greco, and I teach at the Proy School, UC San Diego in San Diego, California. And this is my second year teaching AP African American Studies, but I've also taught other AP courses. I also teach APUSH, and my students just took their exam on Friday. So I'm really excited for the AP African American Studies exam happening on Tuesday. And yeah, so we're going to go through some key concepts, key information from each unit. We've tried to condense it as much as possible. So after we go through the 4 units, we'll have a little Q&A and you'll have a chance to ask for specific topics or concepts that you want to go over, depending on kind of where we are on time. So I'll let Coach Reed take it away for Unit 1. So we have a little slideshow that we'll display as we're going
Yeah.
through this. So we won't really be able to see the chat. We'll be checking it periodically just to kind of see what people are saying. But we are on Zoom and then everybody else is on YouTube. So this is our first time doing this, so it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of get used to how this works. So we thank you for your patience with our newness to this whole process.
Yes, we are figuring out as we go, but I think it'll be time well spent. So let's get it right into it. Unit 1, Origins of the African Diaspora. Um, This is the unit that we all started with. These are some important points that we felt we should share with you guys. You know, what is African American Studies is the first topic. So it's interdisciplinary. So it's not just a history course. It studies history, art, culture, literature, you name it, and we pretty much have explored it. It's evolved over time, becoming an official field. You know, with if we go back to the origins of what we think about Black History Month, the Carter G. Woodson in the early 1900s, but it's not something. It goes back even farther before that. Examining development of ideas about Africa's history and the continent's ongoing relationships with communities of the African diaspora. So that's where the connection between Africa and African Americans and uh, Afro Latinos and Africans throughout the globe, um, you know, or there and the descendants, of that involuntary movement because of the transatlantic slave trade. The African American studies emerged out of the Black Power movement on campuses in the 1960s. I think 1965 to 1972 is the time frame that is considered the Black campus movement, where many students in higher education were trying to push for African American studies departments and ethnic studies departments on campuses. And ultimately, African American studies dispels misconceptions of early Africa as a place with an undocumented or unknowable history. I think that reframing of the misconceptions is a theme that it starts in topic 1. You know, it's the first thing, but if you could probably connect a misconception to each and every one of the topics as you go throughout the framework. So moving on. Topic 2 kind of discusses Africa's history and the diversity of the continent itself, its geography, what is close to, what is nearby, and what is within it. The Red Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Indian Ocean, all bordering the northern and eastern coasts, with the Atlantic Ocean bordering the western coast. The different geographical zones, climate zones of tropical rainforests existing mostly within the region where we know as the Congo, the Sahara Desert stretching across the entire northern part of the continent, which is the largest desert in the world, the Sahel area, the grasslands, um, the Mediterranean, and am I missing one? I think I said them all. Yeah, grassland, Sahara Desert, tropical rainforest, and Mediterranean, that northern coast, and there's a little bit at the southern tip as well. It's kind of hard for me to see the whole thing from my screen sharing and the Zoom tabs at the bottom. But because of the way the climate is set up also dictated, and of course we can't forget the Nile River Valley and the rivers that play a part in the geographical makeup of Africa. But because of the way it's situated, it also leads to what animals live there. Also the way human beings had to migrate throughout the continent and populate it in different places, and the trade routes that came with that, all kind of determining what happens moving forward with the societies that were set up, and why they were set up in the places that they were set up, and how they were able to thrive, or how they fail eventually. Marsha, if at any time I'm like forgetting something, make sure to chime in. Okay, moving from the geographical part of it, the Bantu migration is where we are really first introduced to human beings that are living in ancient Africa, and how things work up. So this is about the ethno-linguistic characteristics of the Bantu people migrating throughout and populating South Africa, West Central Africa, East Africa, and going all throughout, and how they were able to do, why they moved, because of technology growth, overpopulation, agriculture. And you can see this gives a timeline starting with in 3000 BC in this origin right here, and then moving all throughout to all the way up to 1200 CE. So pretty long period of time of people moving around and sharing culture and spreading it out. Genetic qualities are also dispersed through here. So when we think about African people as a very, very diverse group of people, not to say that there's no unity there, but to expect unity amongst all these different people in all these different places in that time is kind of asking a bit much. Moving on. All right. So we talked about what is African American studies so far, the geographical makeup of Africa, and then the Bantu migration, kind of how the continent was populated. It was obviously populated before then, but the Bantu migration being playing the significant role that it played. Now we move into the African kingdoms, these early ancient African kingdoms, covering topic 1.4. The main four of those are Egypt, Nubia, Aksum, and the Nok culture, which is in West Africa. Egypt and Nubia are Nile River Valley civilizations. They were interacting with one another. They were at war with one another. They, Nubia ruled Egypt. Egypt ruled Nubia. But, and everybody pretty much knows about Egypt. Egypt isn't always given the recognition as an African country, though, because it's mostly Arab today. But it is a place that is in Africa for those who didn't know, which is another dispelling of a reframing of a misconception. Aksum is located in what is now uh, Ethiopia and Eritrea on the eastern coast of Africa, just south of the Nile River Valley. The first uh, country to adopt Orthodox Christianity, one of the oldest Christian churches in the world. And the Nok culture, which if we look at these images that are on this slide, you see the terracotta sculptures and the coins from Aksum. But these terracotta sculptures in West Africa really show that these people were thinking, working in a much more advanced society versus the misconception that African people contributed nothing. So these racist stereotypes that characterize these societies are proven false from East and West Africa. The significance here, just going over that and how European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade itself really helped to double down on misconceptions about African people to justify that treatment. All right, more African kingdoms. Overview of the Sudanic Empire. So now we moving strictly to West Africa, where we go to Ghana, Songhai, and Mali, which are all kind of in the same place and one after the other chronologically. So Ghana is the first one. There's a center of trade with gold. Mali, spotlight on Mansa Musa and Timbuktu, center of trade for learning. The fact that books were currency is just an amazing thing in general. Traded gold and salt, and of course we know, we look at the Catalan Atlas and we think about Mansa Musa and the Hajj that he made to Mecca and the significance of that, and how Europeans during that time viewed him as well as other Africans, and versus how they would view them later. And all of these, the growth of Islam plays a significant role in this as well, because that's the reason Mansa Musa was going to Mecca for his Hajj or his pilgrimage at all. Muslims are supposed to make once in their life. So and Songhai being the last of these Sudanic empires within the transatlantic, shifting from trans-Saharan to the Atlantic. Spotlight on the griots. The Epic of Sundiata was a really cool story. Some people say it was a part of the Lion King, or the Lion King got its inspiration from that. So if that's something that might help you remember the word griot or anything about these African kingdoms, that's just another little tidbit of information. Important note, majority of enslaved Africans transported to North America descended from these societies in West Africa. So when we think about people who were in the slave trade, most of them came from these regions in West and West Central Africa. So not to say that they were all kings and queens, because that's what some people like to say, we came from kings and queens. Some people might have. What I would say is that we did come from kingdoms and empires, and whatever role your ancestors might have played, or whoever else's ancestors might have played in that, there definitely were kingdoms there. It wasn't just people living in jungles. Going back to the theme of the reframing of the misconceptions. All right, another kingdom, moving to the Great Zimbabwe, which is just a really cool story in my opinion. I actually was talking about that with my kids, but the stone architecture and the military hub, the trade hub, it was as a part of the Swahili Coast trade, where Africans traded across the Indian Ocean with people from India, with China, and there's all these artifacts that prove this. Mozambique on the eastern coast of Africa, the Swahili language of the Bantu people is another part of that. And then the Portuguese are also eventually come in and take control of this Indian Ocean trade. But in the Great Zimbabwe, there was gold, ivory, cattle were their main commodities that they traded in, and spotlights on what a symbol that it was for Africans to be a part of something so significant that Europeans kind of looked at it and said Africans must not have been able to build that themselves, and to kind of discredit the people who lived that during that time. But those ones still stand up pretty much the one thing that can compare to the pyramids of Egypt in Africa. The Great Zimbabwe would do that. Moving to the Congo, which is a very significant place still to this day, but the Congo was the first large African civilization to convert to Christianity. And we know about the story about, we learned about the story of King Zinga, who and his son and Bimba. I'm sorry, I'm probably ruining those names, but doing my best with that. But one of the sources from that topic was a letter that he wrote to the King of Portugal to kind of say that, we were supposed to be doing trade with one another. I converted to Catholicism and all that, but you still in my good people. And that's not what we had, that's not what we agreed to. You are kind of depopulating my kingdom, and that's not good. But the Portuguese were looking to get ivory, salt, copper, and other textiles, and that human labor was a big thing that they look for. Portugal, if you don't know already, is one that you see often when it comes to the beginning of the slave trade. As really the group that kicked it off. Religious syncretism was a really fun lesson to learn when we think about Africans converting to Catholicism. Not to say that Africans weren't participating in Christianity before the slave trade began, but we look at how Catholicism really played the role that it played in the slave trade, and how if you look at it, just about every country throughout the diaspora, African people who adopted European belief systems, but also intermingled them or mixed them or syncretized them with their own belief systems. throughout the diaspora. So that's always a really that was just I just found that part of this unit really interesting to study about it and learn about it myself. All right. Probably if you guys are having some questions as we going through this, as I'm going fast, just put them in the chat. I will definitely try my best to get through to all of them. All right, so West African leadership, the roles that women played. There were queens who were the matriarchs of the entire civilization or empire or kingdom. That they weren't the second to the husband who was the king. Like they were the ones who were in charge, spiritual leaders, political advisors, traders, educators, pretty much every role that you could play, which is different than most European societies where women weren't really in leadership positions. So Queen Jinga and Zinga, Queen Idea, Adia, I don't know how to pronounce those. I'm gonna just keep it real. Maybe I need to do a class on language, but the roles that they played were very significant as well. And they were in charge in the Congo in the late 15th century. Oh no, this is the rise of slavery. Well, it kind of goes into where slavery begins in Portugal for real. So these queens were in charge right just towards the end of or the beginning of the slave trade. And when the slave trade begins um, in the late 15th century between West Africa and Portugal, like I was saying, when you think about it geographically, Portugal is really close to the coast, the west coast of Africa. So it's a very short distance. African kingdoms grew very wealthy within this. So many did participate in the slave trade, thinking that slavery was the same system that they had in Africa versus what the slaves had in what slavery was going to be in Africa versus what the Europeans' idea of slavery was. Portugal and Spain really take it over and colonize the Atlantic islands, Cabo Verde and Sao Tome, where they start the plantations. All right, so we got cotton, indigo, sugar, and instead of European labor, Africans became the main commodity for that labor. So about 1500, about 50,000 Africans had already been taken to work on islands or in Europe. I think that's it for unit one. But the main takeaways are a major element of his studies, dispelling the misconceptions. Like I said, Africa has been the home of advanced societies, played an important role on the global stage. Can't stress that enough about contributions that Africa made throughout for the globe, that many Western civilizations were able to take what they learned in Africa to build what they were able to create later and use the slave trade to go and surpass African civilizations. And and that's pretty much the next point about slavery rising due to European expansion and global demand for goods produced by slave labor. I'm sure there are some questions in there about that, but I hope I covered it as much as I could.
All right. So you can just keep sharing and advance my slide for me,
Okay.
or you need to give me sharing
Oh,
capability.
I need to, yep.
Okay. That looks
Got it.
okay.
Ta-da, cherry blossoms.
All right, so I'm going to be going through Unit 2. Unit 2 is massive, as I'm sure everybody knows. So I tried to condense it as much as possible, and I'm not really going to be going into a whole lot of detail about each item, because that would just take too long. We'd be here all night talking about the specifics of Unit 2. So I'm just going to kind of refer to things, and I will elaborate on some of the various terms and people, but this is going to be a quick overview because Unit 2 and 3 have a lot of very specific information. So this is really just, again, like an overview to sort of trigger your memory about various topics and themes. Okay, so the kind of first little bit of Unit 2 is the transatlantic slave trade. So there's a few like important terms and people that you need to associate with the transatlantic slave trade, as well as impacts. So Unit 2 started out talking about how not all African people who went to North and South America were enslaved. So there were a lot of Africans who were conquistadors and were part of Spanish conquests. So that created this group of people known as Ladinos. And so Juan Garrido is the first example. You know, he's kind of the first like recorded African person on in the Americas. And then there are some other examples that they go into, like Estevanico. And then about the transatlantic slave trade itself. So the actual transport of captive Africans to the Americas was actually a sort of three-stage process. So the initial capture and then journey to the coast, and then being held on the coast for a period of time in barracoons or even the castles like Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, being held in these prisons before they actually were transported across the Atlantic. And the actual transport across the Atlantic is known as the Middle Passage. So one of the figures that you should associate with the Middle Passage is Olaudah Equiano because of his narrative, one of the very few narratives that they actually have of the Middle Passage journey. I have barracoons on there twice. And then also the Door of No Return associated kind of with that transport, because that was the door. Once they went through that, they were going onto the ships and going off across the Atlantic. And then another term that you should associate with this whole process is commodification. And so commodification means to treat something that doesn't actually have monetary value as an object that has monetary value. So enslaved and captive Africans were commodified. So people shouldn't have monetary value, and yet that is what was going on. That's how they were treated. So that term will likely show up in questions. It's a term that you can use to describe this whole process if there's an FRQ question that deals with the transatlantic slave trade or just slavery in general. And then a big impact of the transatlantic slave trade was the diversity of Black communities across the diaspora. So as you can see, and we've talked about with Unit 1, people are coming from all over Africa, and yet they are going to all sorts of different places. And so that means that, all people going to Brazil, for example, are not necessarily coming from the same parts of Africa. So those places then became increasingly diverse. And that had impacts on the culture and language and belief systems of those places that they went. And the people, kind of created new versions wherever they were. And then we should also think about the impact that this whole thing had on African societies. So especially West African societies where large portions of their populations were taken, they suffered a lot of economic turmoil, political instability, and this also had a real human impact on the people. They lost family members, the trauma of the whole process, the fear of being captured, all of that trickled down into various aspects of their societies. So we need to also remember that, we're talking about real people here, and the impact of such a big development on their history. So another really big thing that's part of Unit 2 and really the rest of the course is this theme of resistance. So we learn about all of these awful things that happen to African Americans, but we have to also remember that through it all, there are various forms of resistance. And from the very beginning, there was resistance to their situation during the transatlantic slave trade. So they had various forms of resistance. And again, this is going to continue throughout the course, from sort of arguing against slavery. So we saw that through slave narratives like Olata Equiano, slave ship diagrams, such as the diagram of the slave ship Brooks. And this was created by, largely white abolitionists in England, but this was widely circulated and really was making people more aware of the dehumanizing conditions of the Middle Passage, and also through various forms of literature, poetry, Phillis Wheatley being one, and then also physical resistance on the ships themselves. Captives doing hunger strikes, jumping overboard, and then also revolting. And so the Amistad case is something that you should associate with the transatlantic slave trade. As we know, they were able to successfully argue that they were, taken illegally captive and they were able to return to Africa. But we should also know that, and this is going to come up again, that there was backlash to these resistance efforts. So even though we have this diagram of the slave ship, we are actually missing the different elements that were added by European captors, adding things to prevent the captives from resisting. So guns and nets to prevent people from jumping overboard, various instruments used to force feed them when they were doing hunger strikes, and other forms of torture to just prevent people from even thinking about revolting. So now we're moving into the experiences of the enslaved. So once they get to the Americas, there's a whole slew of things that happens throughout the next couple of centuries. So one big thing that we need to understand is that the growth of slavery was due to the demand for goods such as cash crops. So the big cash crop at first is sugar, and then in like the 18th century, heavy on like tobacco, rice, and indigo. And then in the 19th century, cotton becomes the major good that is in demand. Throughout all this, there is a growth of economic dependence on cash crops. And especially in the United States, there's this sort of interdependence, or the North and South working together. So especially with the growth of cotton, the North developing their textile industry, which relied on cotton coming from the South. So even though, by the time the 19th century rolls around, the North doesn't really have slavery as much anymore, or they're definitely phasing it out, they're still benefiting from slavery tremendously. We also see the implementation of slave codes, which, as we know, were laws restricting the movement, communication, literacy, and just basic human rights of enslaved people. And one of the examples of slave codes dealt with who was enslaved. And so we have this policy of partus sequitur ventrum, which established that the status of a child, whether they were free or enslaved, was derived from their mother. The growth of the cotton industry was due to the cotton gin. So that's definitely something that, you should associate with this time period and be able to talk about in FRQs that have to deal with the growth of slavery. And so that led to the growth of the domestic slave trade and the forcible transport of enslaved people from the upper South to the lower South. And that movement was known as the Second Middle Passage. And part of that was auctioning off real people. very painful stories. We read various primary sources having to deal with the family separation that was part of slave auctions. Um, Also, jumping over to the development side, kind of on this same topic, we should remember that not all enslaved people were working on plantations picking cotton, that depending on where they lived, especially if they were living in the upper South, like in the cities like Baltimore, Maryland, for example, Frederick Douglass is a great example of an enslaved person that did not pick cotton. He did agricultural work to some extent, but then he was also like a domestic servant. He did other like trade skills. So that's one thing that we should keep in mind, that enslaved labor was not just plantation labor. Um, Also, the growth of slavery was facilitated by what we call Indian removal. So the five civilized tribes, they also practiced slavery kind of in an effort to keep their land. Um, Especially those who are more familiar with US history, that the US government was very interested in the land in the Southeast, particularly like in Georgia, Florida, Mississippi area. And in an effort to keep their land and appear civilized, these tribes, the Cherokee, Seminole, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, they practiced slavery, and they were also benefiting from it economically. And when they were removed from their lands with the Indian Removal Act in 1830, that freed up a lot of land for the expansion of slavery. And they also took their enslaved people with them to the lands that they were forced to move to in Oklahoma. With slave codes, especially with partus sequitur ventrum, we see the codification of hereditary slavery. So this is another term, codification, making something into law. That's something that might appear in answer choices or questions. And then hereditary slavery, slavery being based on your family line, as opposed to ancient forms of slavery or slavery practice in other parts of the world that may have been based on other things, like being a prisoner of war, being in debt, stuff like that. So this is just strictly based on family line. And then we also see racial classifications. So, race being a social construct, this is a perfect example of that, about how there's a growing awareness and classification of who is white and who is Black. And especially with policies like partus sequitur ventrum, see the evolution of sort of this distinction between those who are Black and those who are not. And so we see this concept of hypodescent, or the one drop rule, that if you are part Black, then you are Black. And then that has consequences for you as far as your status as free or enslaved, the different rights that you may have, and so on and so forth. Then also, as I mentioned earlier, the family separation due to various aspects of slavery, especially the domestic slave trade and Second Middle Passage. And then all of this really kind of creates this huge wealth gap. You have generations of people who are stuck in slavery, who are not able to inherit any property of their own. And that prevents them from being able to, be economically independent. And that has repercussions for generations to come. Um, Also, another thing that kind of grows out of this is um, various forms of music with African influence. So talked about earlier about how the transatlantic slave trade really spread people of different African cultures and ethnic groups around. And so once they're all together in these sort of like mixed communities, we see the growth of various aspects of culture. So lots of forms of music with African influences. So the development of the banjo, and then also various techniques within music, call and response, ring shout, clapping, improvisation. And then also, especially with the growth of Christianity, even though many enslaved people who came to the Americas were either Christian or Muslim, there's an increase in the amount of enslaved people who are Christian due to forced conversion in slavery. And so there's increased use of biblical references in their music. Another really important thing that's part of the experience of the enslaved is the Fugitive Slave Act, which was part of the Compromise of 1850. So there was an original version of the Fugitive Slave Act in the Constitution, or in the early Republic. So this was where it was illegal to help an enslaved person who was escaping from slavery, that you had to return them to their enslaver. And the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed in 1850 was a new and stricter version, where the accused person was then taken before a commissioner, and the commissioner earned $5 if they found the accused to be innocent, a free person, and then they earned $10 if they were, found to be an actual, escaped enslaved person. So it was basically a rigged system, and that obviously generated a lot of fear and anxiety, and also impacted the resistance efforts that enslaved people and their allies had to undertake. So speaking of resistance, again, African Americans are not just taking this, lying down. They're resisting in all sorts of different ways. So there's political, intellectual, and cultural forms of resistance. So we see this in various lawsuits, such as Elizabeth Key, who, kind of, her father was a free man, and that was when the status of an enslaved person passed through the father. And so she successfully argued in court that she should be a free person. And then right after that, they passed the slave code to change it to being based on the status of the mother. Also, the Dred Scott decision. So even though the Dred Scott decision was not in favor of Dred Scott, that is a form of resistance, where he was arguing that he should be free because he had been taken to a series of free territories by his enslaver. And yet the Supreme Court not only said he was not free, but that, he and any African American were not citizens and were never meant to be citizens. Also have the abolitionist movement. So many abolitionists, but kind of a great example of a famous abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. Other forms of resistance that were sort of indirect forms of resistance were maintenance of African culture through various forms of music and art and dance. Spirituals, which, had hidden messages for trying to escape, just communicating their general thoughts and feelings about slavery. Slave narratives. So Solomon Northup, his 12 Years a Slave narrative. Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Frederick Douglass also had a famous narrative, even though that's not one of the required sources for the course. There was also discussion about going back to Africa. So the emigration movement, Martin Delany being a huge proponent of that. So especially after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, a lot of African Americans, especially free Blacks, were kind of saying, well, it's clear that we're not welcome here. And so we might as well go back to Africa and just sort of do our own thing. There was also a pretty active free Black community that was active in the abolitionist movement, also kind of just generally talking about ways to advance the situation of the African American community. They had these colored conventions. They had various discussions about what they should call themselves. Should they emphasize their Americanness? Should they say that they're African? There were various debates over like what aspects of their identity they should be emphasizing. And then we also see discussions around intersectionality. So when we talk about intersectionality in African American studies, a lot of that discussion has to do with the experiences of Black women. So women like Maria Stewart and Harriet Jacobs, were speaking about the unique experiences of being Black and a woman. So Maria Stewart was mainly focused on education and, women's political involvement. And then Harriet Jacobs was also talking about, the experiences of enslaved women and the sexual violence that they experience. And then also photography. So there was a topic that was all about how African Americans were utilizing photography as a way to, have a record of themselves for one, but also to portray themselves as, sophisticated actual people. And then we also have examples of physical resistance. So the most common being daily forms of resistance, breaking tools, stealing, slowing down work, letting animals out, destroying buildings, stuff like that. Also physical fighting of enslavers and other oppressors like overseers and stuff like that. Various forms of self-liberation. So, death, and then also means of escape. So the Underground Railroad and Maroon societies, which were, societies that consisted of, formerly enslaved people who were just sort of hiding out. And some of these Maroon societies were hidden, and some were more out in the open. Or others, like the Great Dismal Swamp, they knew that they were there, but they didn't necessarily want to go in there to go get them. And then there were various forms of radical resistance and rebellions. So, just kind of mention these here. You're going to need to know more specifics about each of these, but Stoner Rebellion, Haitian Revolution, and then also inspired by that was the Louisiana Slave Revolt or the German Coast Uprising of 1811, Nat Turner's Rebellion, and then a couple of people you can associate with radical resistance are David Walker and Henry Highland Garnett. And then also during the Civil War, Harriet Tubman led the Combahee River Raid. Okay, and then Unit 2 closes out with how slavery ends. So again, this is due to the efforts of the abolitionist movement, but also the Civil War is really the key component here. So the Civil War was really pivotal for African Americans. Enslaved people were escaping to Union lines. As soon as they saw the Union Army, they were out of there. And they were telling the Union generals, like, we'll help you as long as you just take us away. We'll tell you where to go. We'll help build your forts. We'll carry stuff for you. We'll spy for you. Just let us stay here. And so the Union generals were having all of these, African Americans, these enslaved people just with them. And they asked the federal government, they asked Congress, they asked President Lincoln, they were like, what do we do with these people? And so Congress passed a couple different laws known as the Confiscation Acts, which made it legal for them to take these enslaved people because they said that they were contraband of war, that technically the Confederacy was using these enslaved people to help wage the war. They were working on their plantations. Some of them were being used to help build Confederate forts and cooking for them and stuff like that. So they're like, well, technically the enemy is using these people. They're using them to wage war against us. So we can technically take them away. And so that really paves the way for the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'll talk about in a moment. So throughout the war, African Americans were helping the Union Army in official and unofficial ways. So they were serving as cooks, nurses, spies, and then actual soldiers. Once it's clear that the war is about ending slavery, that is now a goal of the war, there was some backlash in the North, particularly Irish immigrant groups who were protesting the draft. There was a lot of sort of bitterness about the war going on as long as it did. And that was just one of the reasons why people, rioted in opposition to the draft. There were other reasons as well that we don't necessarily need to know for this course. So the Emancipation Proclamation, which I should have put the date on here, Lincoln issues it in September of 1862. It becomes official January 1st, 1863. So that frees, or it sets up freedom for all enslaved people in the states that are currently in rebellion. So that's states in the Confederacy that are not currently occupied by Union forces. A big impact of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it opens up military service for African American men. and 200,000 of those men answer the call. Frederick Douglass actually specifically encourages African Americans to join the war effort because he says this is going to be the best argument about why slavery should be abolished and why we should be considered equal citizens. Um, Also, a big thing about the Emancipation Proclamation is that it did not immediately free enslaved people in the Confederacy. The Union Army was actually the way that they were officially liberated, and many enslaved people, self-liberated once the Emancipation Proclamation was official, but for the most part, a lot of people had to wait for the Union Army to come through and liberate them, or the state had to essentially kind of be in a situation where, it was safe to leave. And then also a big thing that kind of comes out of the Emancipation Proclamation is Juneteenth. So there were people in Galveston, Texas, who were not fully aware of the Emancipation Proclamation until basically the war was over. And, they had to be told by uh, the Union Army that, oh, by the way, like, you're free now. The Emancipation Proclamation freed you. And so the Juneteenth holiday is in celebration of them learning about that. And so slavery is officially abolished by the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. So the amendment does pass Congress before the war is officially over. Civil War ends officially with Robert E. Lee's surrender in April of 1865. And then the amendment is officially ratified in December of 1865. And the condition for the Confederate States to re-enter the Union was that they had to abolish slavery. They had to ratify the 13th Amendment, or basically, they had to agree that slavery would no longer exist. So some big takeaways from Unit 2 is that enslavement dehumanized and commodified African Americans. This, again, treating them as objects to be bought and sold, just a very dark part of our history. Another thing, not all African Americans were enslaved. Not all of them worked on plantations. They had a variety of skills, and their lives varied greatly depending on where they were living. And African Americans utilized a variety of direct and indirect forms of resistance, and they were exercising their agency whenever possible. And also, the abolition of slavery happened in large part due to the efforts of African Americans themselves. So we give a lot of credit to Abraham Lincoln for freeing the slaves. And as a major fan of Abraham Lincoln, he does deserve a lot of credit. But the thing, the Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment, those things would not have happened without the actions of African Americans and the resistance efforts that they were utilizing throughout the 19th century, but especially during the Civil War. Okay, so
I do want to jump in real quick.
yeah, go
We
ahead.
we we already 55 minutes in. That's how much this is, and obviously Unit 2 is going to take a significant amount of time, and so make sure that you guys who are here, it turns out it's like 50 people, and at one point I saw it and I was looking in the chat, like, go ahead and lock in, because if you don't, you're gonna miss something. And there's only a couple days left. We are less than 48 hours away from when y'all gonna be taking this test. So, clean it up in the chat and stay locked in. I was looking for questions in there about actually specific things. I did see some things about parts of sequitur ventrum, which I think Miss Greco did a great job of covering that. So if you want to go back and watch that part again, or just go find it within your notes or whatever. So we gonna keep moving. Miss Greco gonna cover Unit 3, and I'm gonna cover Unit 4. I know it's getting late here in she on the West Coast, so it's a little earlier. I know some of y'all might have to go to bed or whatever, but this is gonna be recorded. It's gonna be posted, and for my students that I'm gonna share this, I'm gonna go over this again in class as much as I can, or I'll share it with you to be able to ask questions for yourself. All right.
Hey.
I was doing that to just give you a pause so you could breathe a
Oh,
little bit too.
thank you, thank you. Okay, so you have to hear me a little bit more. I'm gonna go through Unit 3. Unit 3 is not as much stuff, so I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible. So Unit 3 is the practice of freedom. Unit 3 is definitely a roller coaster of highs and lows. So I kind of broke it up into different kind of time periods within Unit 3. So the first part is Reconstruction. So Reconstruction had a lot of potential. There were a lot of great things that happened as a result. So we have the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment, African Americans getting citizenship. We have the establishment of birthright citizenship, which impacts people of all backgrounds today. If you're born in the United States, then you are a citizen of the United States, and that is due to the 14th Amendment. And 14th Amendment also grants equal protection under the law to all citizens. Um, and then we have the 15th Amendment in 1870, which granted Black men the right to vote. So basically says you cannot discriminate based on race. And at this time, women did not have the right to vote. And in fact, this issue caused a rift in the women's suffrage movement between those who supported Black male suffrage and those who felt like white women should get the right to vote first. We have our leaders, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who said some, very strong things against African Americans getting the right to vote. So, but that had huge impacts for the African American community, Black office holders at the local, state, and federal levels. One thing we should also note is that Black men in the South actually got the right to vote before the 15th Amendment. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 actually granted Black men the right to vote before the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment was actually granting the right to vote to Black men in the North, which, as I kind of said earlier, there was a lot of opposition to that. So kind of even before the 15th Amendment was passed, kind of between 1867 and 1870, and then, in the next few years after that, many Black office holders at all different levels of society. So we have people ranging from like sheriffs, justice of the peace, county clerks, all the way up to, congressmen serving in the House of Representatives and senators. Another, huge thing that happens is enslaved people are able to reunify with their loved ones. So there's a lot of people putting in advertisements for decades looking for people that they had lost track of in slavery due to that family separation. A lot of people getting married officially for the first time because enslaved people were not able to legally marry. So people getting legally married and then also changing their surnames. So changing their last names. A lot of enslaved people, if they did have a last name, it may have been their enslaver's last name. And so they wanted to change that. Maybe they wanted to change their name entirely. So there was a lot of that going on. And the Freedmen's Bureau was actually handling all of this. And the Freedmen's Bureau also helped with education opportunities. They helped establish schools throughout the South. There were many people from the North who came down to the South to provide, to be teachers in the schools that not only were for African Americans, but also many poor whites who were illiterate. And then there were a lot of people who moved to free states and territories. So they are no longer enslaved. So they decided to just go elsewhere. But then unfortunately, there's some low points of Reconstruction. And basically throughout, but definitely towards the second half of Reconstruction, and when we're into the 1870s, we've got the inaction of Black codes, which placed restrictions on African Americans, their movement, their communication. They couldn't own guns. They, at times couldn't own property, things like that. They had to have employment. That's a big one. That's going to get a lot of people. And then we also see a lot of backlash through racial violence. lynching being the big one. And remember, lynching is not just hanging, but any killing that is done by a mob of people, without going through the justice system. We have various groups carrying this out, like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, etc. But we should note that a lot of times lynchings were just spur of the moment things, people in the community, sometimes law enforcement participating. So it's not just these groups, it's just random people in the community. We also see disenfranchisement. So even though Black men have the right to vote, there's various obstacles put in their way, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and then also straight up violence and intimidation to prevent them from voting or taking office. So there were a lot of times African American would get elected to office and then they would be threatened if they actually took their position. Another big problem after slavery. So one of the things that formerly enslaved people wanted was land. They wanted to be economically self-sufficient, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Even though they were supposed to be granted, 40 acres and a mule, President Andrew Johnson basically canceled all that out, returned land to former enslavers. And although some people did get small farms in some areas, for the most part, that did not happen. And so as a result, they had to go back and work for their former enslaver, or they became sharecroppers, also participating in the crop lien system. And so this, these systems put them into debt. And debt was one of the things that could land you in prison. So, that created additional problems. And then this whole thing prevented the accumulation of generational wealth. We also see the rise of the convict leasing system, the beginnings, the real beginnings of the prison industrial complex. So, people getting arrested for ticky-tack fouls, violating black codes, not having proof of employment, being out at the wrong place at the wrong time, gathering together, and then, or having debt, and then being put in prison and having all these legal fees, being put into more debt, and then having to work off their debt through this forced labor. And that's an aspect of the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment says, you can't have involuntary servitude unless it's for conviction of a crime. So that loophole, kind of leads us into this whole new system of oppression of African Americans. So that really starts during Reconstruction, and it just takes off and continues for decades. So then we enter into what we call the nadir of race relations. So this is the lowest point in American race relations. So this is characterized by segregation and racial violence. So we have Jim Crow laws, so de jure or by law segregation. We got the Supreme Court weighing in with Plessy versus Ferguson, basically saying you can have segregation as long as it's separate but equal. And even though that case was only specific to railroad cars, it was applied to all different aspects of society. Basically, people interpreted that as a green light for segregation. There were various Southern lynch laws that justified racial violence, the perpetuation of, stories about lynching in the media that fueled all these stereotypes of Black criminality, ideas that, Black men were trying to commit sexual assault against white women, that Black people were guilty of crimes, that if they were accused by a white person, and Black people not being able to testify in their own defense, all of these things, contributed to lynching and also convict leasing, with Black people being imprisoned for crimes. We also see kind of an explosion of violence after World War I with the Red Summer of 1919 and the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. So those two things, I'm not going to go into detail, but those are two things you should definitely be aware of. And then again, through all this, there is resistance to various aspects of what's going on. So we got Ida B. Wells, her anti-lynching investigative journalism was really key to exposing how, lynching was based off of these stereotypes that really had no basis in fact. various forms of resistance through literature, poetry, and music. So we have different examples of, pieces where they were sort of expressing how they were really feeling or expressing, sort of determination against their situation. Then we also have this concept of racial uplift. So African Americans really kind of reached a point where they were thinking, okay, well, we're free from slavery, not enslaved anymore. We have all these other systems of oppression. So how are we going to get out of this? Like, how are we ultimately really going to practice freedom? And there were different ideas about how to go about doing this. There were various forms of education. So Booker T. Washington and his industrial education, and then W.E.B. Du Bois kind of emphasizing more of like a, academic education. Also Anna Julia Cooper weighing in, emphasizing education for women, and then Carter G. Woodson also emphasizing the study of Black history. So that leads to the growth of African American studies, African American history as a field. We also have women actively being part of this conversation with the women's club movement and women's suffrage efforts. So we have various women involved in that. We've got the establishment of HBCUs and Black fraternities and sororities with the National Pan-Hellenic Council, aka the Divine Nine, and then different forms of artistic expression, which I'm going to expand on here in a moment. And then also the Back to Africa movement, led by Marcus Garvey. So again, that topic of immigration, thinking, well, we are obviously not able to prosper here. Let's just go and start over somewhere else. Let's go back to the land of our heritage and just do our thing over there. There were various political and religious institutions like the NAACP, the UNIA. Also, I didn't put it on here, but you should associate like Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism with the whole Back to Africa movement and Marcus Garvey, and just this time period in general. And then also the growth of existing institutions like the American Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME Church, which had been around for, since like the 18th century, but had really, grown and became an important organization where people could mobilize politically and also just sort of come together socially. And then we also have the growth of Black-owned businesses, Madam C.J. Walker being very successful with her hair products. She's the first female millionaire, and also the Black press and Black-owned banks helping more Black-owned businesses get started. All right. So then another big part of Unit 3 is the Great Migration. So you should know that this is the, the voluntary migration of African Americans out of the South to the North, Midwest, and Western United States. So there are a variety of reasons why they were doing this, one being racial violence and Jim Crow laws, but then also they had pull factors like job opportunities in factories and such that were due to job openings due to World War I and World War II. So a lot of men went off to war, and the war industries expanded tremendously in order to produce all of the things that we need for war, supplies, weapons, planes, boats, stuff like that. So a lot of job opportunities in these cities, and people moved there for that. And then also crop failures in the South made it difficult to be a sharecropper. So then effects of the Great Migration. So the big effect of the Great Migration is the new Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance, but kind of side effects are that this caused African American communities in the cities to become increasingly diverse. So we have people from the South now, mingling and associating with people who were living in the North, sort of the blending of those cultures. And so we see like the growth of various forms of music and literature and stuff like that. This also contributes to racial tensions in cities, especially after the wars. So like for World War I, for example, experienced a huge increase in African American population due to people moving there for the war industry jobs. And that caused a lot of tension, a lot of backlash in cities like Chicago, where the white men came back from the war and they're like, well, wait a second, like our city looks completely different. There's all these people that weren't here before. What's going on? And that contributed to the racial violence that happened during the Red Summer. So again, the big impact of the Great Migration is the growth of African American culture. So that is in the New Negro movement or kind of the Harlem Renaissance. These terms are kind of interchangeable, but a good way of thinking about it is that the Harlem Renaissance is an aspect of the New Negro movement. So the New Negro movement is all about, sort of redefining themselves, having pride in being Black, and expressing themselves culturally. So the Harlem Renaissance is that growth of artistic and intellectual expression. So we've got the creation of a Black aesthetic through various forms of art, music, photography, and literature. So we've got a whole host of different artists and writers and musicians that you can associate with this time period. So some big takeaways from Unit 3 is that freedom brought a lot of success for African Americans. You see them, politically participating, succeeding economically, especially like the creation of like these communities, these Black Wall Streets, various Black owned businesses, people getting education, reconnecting with family. There's a lot of good things that happened during this time period. However, the backlash really undermines a lot of it and prevents it from really becoming what it could have been. The historians talk about Reconstruction as being a second founding of the United States, how we really redefined what it meant to be a citizen and, what the relationship of like the government was going to be to society in solving these issues of race. But ultimately, the reversal, the dismantling of a lot of these different Reconstruction reforms prevented those things from being fulfilled. And also, racial violence and oppression is a big, big aspect of this time period. So, when you're thinking about the late 19th through like mid 20th century, you should be thinking about how this is a period of racial violence and oppression. But throughout this period, African Americans were resisting in various ways and achieving success. And a big part of that was an increased awareness of themselves and how they were willing to express themselves, and also like just a more active approach to the role that they were going to play in society. And this unit really paves the way for Unit 4. The civil rights movement didn't just come out of nowhere. People didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what, we want to fight for our rights. A lot of that self-awareness and mobilization, that organization happened in Unit 3, happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Coach Reed. You can finish up our last unit, movements and debates. So I
Alrighty.
will let you share your screen.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just to round out Unit 3 and kind of how you were saying that the resistance that had been going on during Unit 3 is the same resistance that was going on in Unit 2. The difference is that now that slavery is not a thing anymore, people have the freedom to move around and they can make a lot more independent decisions, even though that they're risking their lives doing it is just the same way. There are people and there are laws that, you're not stuck in one spot. You can leave. You still, like I said, you're still risking it, but just that little bit more freedom, a little bit more of independence, a little bit more of mobility gave people a bigger opportunity. And that's the theme, that kind of carries on in the Unit 4, because the violent response to each and every bit of progress that African Americans make throughout throughout the country's history is always there. So as we move into Unit 4, let me get my screen up before we wrap up for the night too. Appreciate the audience. Y'all still doing too much in the chat a little bit, but you know, I guess we got to have a little fun with it because it is kind of a deep, dark story to be told in a lot of different ways. And that's a part of it that I think if you carry that idea with you into your test of what this is all about, it'll help you out. But you do want to, as hard as much as we have to prepare, we do want to enjoy ourselves. We want to have fun, throughout the struggle. All right. So no struggle, no progress. So struggling to get y'all to lock in sometimes. But all right, so um I had to put these slides together at my son's baseball game. We'll just keep it real. So they're a little wordy in some cases, but starting from the anti-colonial first instructional focus, the anti-colonial movements and the early Black freedom movement, the negritude and the Grismo movement. Now, these are concepts that I was very, very unfamiliar with before I started teaching this course. But what I learned about negritude and in my little French accent, negritude and negrismo. Cherie, don't judge me. I see you in the chat. But anyway, negritude, connecting to the French Caribbean speaking countries and negrismo being the Latin American countries, embracing Black culture and embracing their Blackness and connecting to the new Negro movement. These are all movements that are one and the same. Just the new Negro movement taking place in America, the negritude movement taking place in the French colonial countries, and the negrismo movement taking place in the Latin countries. Yeah, so that whole thing, protesting through writing, through art, through expressive culture and celebrating these contributions, cultural pride, political activism, all of these things are going together. When we just talked about what's going on in the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement. Alan Locke is another name that you want to remember, who coined that term, New Negro. But when you think about that he might be one that comes up in a source or something like that. Moving from there into segregation, discrimination, and how it persisted in the United States after the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, after the passing of the Reconstruction Amendments. Segregation, de facto, is a term used in the essential knowledge, just means it's a matter of fact. It is what it is, even though it's not legalized in all cases. It remains the thing of the day, even after Brown versus the Board of Education, which ruled segregation unconstitutional in public places. So remember the Brown versus the Board of Education pretty much overturns the Plessy versus Ferguson, which says separate but equal is legal. So after Brown versus the Board of Education takes place, before these schools are just coached, everybody doesn't just say, hey, okay, let's all go to school together. That's not what happened. So white families start moving to the suburbs, and you get the development of the suburb living that we see today as so prominent. It wasn't always a thing. There were many white families who did live in urban communities before this and went to public schools. But once the desegregation takes place, in public places, transportation, restaurants, hotels, everywhere else, white families kind of move and create their own spaces that will help them to remain segregated. African Americans, one of the things when they created jitneys to provide transportation for themselves. In 1944, after World War II, or towards the end of World War II, the GI Bill was created to support all the veterans, 1.2 million of these being Black. But because the way it was constructed, the states were left with the job of passing out the benefits for the GI Bill, which was health benefits. If you have veterans in your family, you can ask them about it. Health benefits, housing, business loans, All of these things are not granted to African Americans in Jim Crow states and in northern states in many cases as well. Then housing discrimination comes up in general, with redlining being, you know, cities drawing lines on a map, making it illegal for Black people to live across these lines. And it denied, I squeezed this in, that denied African Americans upward mobility through housing, and how that can help you as far as generational wealth goes. It also denies you access to public amenities like parks and recreational spaces. It also denies you access to public schools that might have more resources. It also denies you access to health care. It might put you in a place where you're living where the air pollution is a lot worse. So all of these things are, like I said, the GI Bill was passed and it was a great thing. Brown versus the Board of Education denies segregation, makes it illegal, but there's always that response to it. So like I said, that just remember that when you study in American history and you kind of looking through it. All right, so then we go into what becomes the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement as we know it. Obviously, Martin Luther King is that key person that we all know about. But there were the big six: Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Ralph Abernathy, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, and A. Philip Randolph. And then these organizations, the NAACP, which was founded by, well, two of the founders were W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was Martin Luther King's, and then the Urban League. And all of these movements had multiracial membership, and many people from different backgrounds were all involved in it. Bayard Rustin had a big role in all of these events that are on in the part to the right, but because he was openly gay, he faced discrimination. And then these women of the movement: Ella Baker, who was known as the mother of the civil rights movement, and was a member of NAACP, SCLC, and SNCC. Fannie Lou Hamer was a freedom rider and a member of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Excuse the typos. Dorothy Height was president of the National Council of Negro Women. And Josephine Baker was a singer and an activist. Oh, I want to be able to read that down there. And her being an artist and other artists who were involved in the civil rights movement brought global attention to the struggle, which was music. All of these arts from artists that were from all over the globe as well. So the main strategy of these organizations and the civil rights movement itself was nonviolent direct action. The strategies were freedom rides, marches, protests, boycotts, sit-ins, all which were met with violent responses. So people lost their lives in that process as well. The bus boycott in 1955 was pretty much where the civil rights movement really got its foundation, and Martin Luther King backing Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a secretary of the NAACP. Martin Luther King, as a young preacher who moves to Montgomery, where his wife is from Alabama, is the reason for that. This is where it really gets started. Then the Little Rock crisis in 1957, where the Little Rock Nine are trying to go to school, Central High in Arkansas. There's I forget the name of the musician, and I didn't put him in there, but he wrote a protest song. Yeah, I don't know what kind of typo I got going on down here, but there was music and faiths, traditions from back in the day that were part of the struggle. So just like during slavery, they sang songs, they went to church, and they prayed about it. Then the March on Washington in 1963, Martin Luther King gives "I Have a Dream" speech. They signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They do the Selma March in 1965, and the Voting Rights Act is signed not long after Bloody Sunday. And then the Fair Housing Act. So we talked about redlining and housing discrimination that took place after the GI Bill. And then in 1968, the government passed the Fair Housing Act. Hold up, this thing's in the way again. Poets in the Negrismo movement connected the civil rights struggle to the U.S. in those Latin American countries. Lord have mercy. I'm good for a typo or two though, so it's all good. I'll fix it later. All right, where we at? Where we at? Okay, faith and music, important elements of inspiration and community mobilization during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Freedom songs emerge, adaptation of hymns, spirituals, gospel song, labor union songs in Black churches. So the singing never stops. Many people in my class did presentations on music, so I think we have a good idea of how that works. Just make sure that you understand it's never just singing songs for fun, it's singing songs that's connected to the struggle, which is a lot of people's problem with today's music. That connection, it seems to have been lost somewhere along the lines. That's kind of irrelevant to the test probably, but it's something worth considering. And if you want to make a view of it, and just an observation that I think is fair. All right, freedom songs inspire African Americans, many of whom risking their lives. But when you think about the old tapes of the civil rights movement and hearing people singing "We shall overcome," you know, uh, all those types of songs really played a part in, you know, the struggle itself. And the lyrics of those songs always telling a story, are always trying to say something that's important about uplifting themselves, whether it's faith-based or not. But the majority of it is connected to a spiritual belief as well. All right, that was a extra. All right, diasporic solidarity. So what does that even mean? That just means people throughout the diaspora keeping it solid with each other, sticking together and having unity. In the 50s and 60s, the colonial ties that a lot of these African countries had with European countries are starting to go away. And some of these African countries are fighting for independence against colonization. This is a connection that's made, though, through African Americans who are seeing this, Latin Americans who are seeing the African countries gaining their independence from European countries, and they are connecting to each other based off that struggle and saying, hey, if they can do it over there, we can do it over here. Meanwhile, don't forget that Africa during the 50s and 60s, this is before the Black campus movement. So these misconceptions that we are reframing today in 2024, or the belief that everyone believes is true, or they are the status quo for the knowledge that is out there in the world. So most people don't believe African countries are gaining anything. Most people don't believe African countries have any history worth having, or they're not worthy of the respect and that unity. But our leaders of the civil rights movement of the time were really kind of speaking to that, moving towards Black power. So, Black people, I said it about Unit 1 in the Bantu migration, are not a monolith. So some people who are, going against or who are looking at the nonviolent integrationists and saying that that's not going to get it done. So they start looking at self-determination, cultural pride, and self-defense, not nonviolence, and definitely not violence towards others in random acts, but just to defend yourself like most people normally would. The whole nonviolent idea is not really a natural thing. So when we look at people, some people who say Martin Luther King was weaker because he didn't want to fight back, it actually takes more strength than that. That's a conversation for another time too. But Malcolm X, my namesake, was the main promoter of this Black Pride. He is the symbol of this self-determination. There's very little about his story in here, but the main points in the essential knowledge is that he was with the Nation of Islam. I would have to give you all kind of background information on that. That Ed Puzzle, that crash course with Clint Smith about Malcolm X is a great watch for that story. But he did end up splitting with them because of a bad relationship with Elijah Muhammad. But the Nation of Islam definitely was uh, something that pushed for Black power, pushed for self-determination, cultural pride, and had a built a built-in self-defense program, which is called the Fruit of Islam. Moving on from that, Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965, and the Black Panther Party is founded in 1966, and they are inspired by him, and they create the 10-point program, which sought fair housing, education, jobs, healthcare, prison reform, um, amongst other things. They implemented a free breakfast, free healthcare, free clothing programs called the Survivor Program. So if you're taking notes right now, that's what they was called. And they embraced their Second Amendment rights, which is the right to bear arms, which California actually changed their laws and made it illegal to carry guns around after the Black Panther Party started doing it. And they also, with a lot of sexism that took place in the Black and civil rights movement, which we'll explore like in the next slide, uh, there were prominent women who did play roles in the Black Panther Party, specifically Kathleen Cleaver, who was the wife of Eldridge Cleaver, but more importantly, I think she was over communications, and then Elaine Brown, who became the president of the entire Black Panther Party during the 70s. Right. All right. Black women's significant roles in the movement. Of course, Black women are always involved and got their handprints on something that is uplifting of others, but they weren't allowed to be in the leadership role. So when we look at the Big Six, there's no women in there, but we know Ella Baker was right there. We know that Fannie Lou Hamer played a very significant role. Dorothy Height meeting with the president, doing all these other great things. The list goes on and on. So writers like Gwendolyn Brooks and Maury Evans, this is directly from Essential Knowledge. They explore it in their writing and kind of just talk about intersectionality and look at it from you could say, an interdisciplinary human experience when they talk about how being a Black woman adds to you know, their part of the struggle. If we could take it right back to Harriet Jacobs and Anna Julia Cooper in Unit 2, who kind of said these same things. So you can kind of see a continuity of a lot of the themes when we look at Units 2, 3, and 4 about the experiences. Yeah, and this is me writing that Black women have to navigate all parts of their identity. And they still do. All women do. All right. Diversity within Black communities. I think these are some things that you guys as teenagers are starting to be able to grasp some of those concepts right now. But like one particular growth of Black middle class took place because of the civil rights gains. So all of this progress that is being made, all of these things that Black people have been resisting and uplifting and risking their lives and losing their lives to get, our generation and the generation before us are able to access some of those things. When I think about who my great grandparents were and what they had access to versus myself, obviously there's a significant difference there. They grew up in the nadir, and I'm growing up in 2024. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, but we'll leave that alone. All right. But there's access to resources. So now higher education is not a far-fetched thing. Jobs and hiring because of fair housing, the act has been passed, Civil Rights Act has been passed, the Voting Rights Act has been passed. People can get political jobs, state jobs, city jobs. Urbanization increased opportunities too. So African Americans in the South who mostly lived in rural communities are now moving into cities and getting other employment in the business sector, whether they were doing it here in the South or they remained after slavery, or their parents might have migrated to bigger cities in the North, like Chicago, New York, Detroit, St. Louis, where these factories and Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, all these other places where people have gone, and they start to own their own businesses and they start to be entrepreneurs for themselves and start to understand the economy and how to make it work for themselves. And there's no legal way for them to be discriminated against. So is there some hate towards them for their success, of course, but there's also a lot of white support. There's also a lot of legal support. There's also a lot of Black people who are becoming lawyers and studying the law and being able to participate in it. And owning restaurants and becoming bankers and getting themselves financially literate to uplift themselves in the ways that Booker T. Washington said through industrial education, but also in the ways W.B. Du Bois said in through classical education. Hope y'all still with me. All right, Black political gains. These are from the essential knowledge, but you just really can understand that Black people gained a lot of political power right after the Civil War, right? So then the response to that happens. They build in all these codes and block the voting. Well, after the Voting Act is passed in 1965 and people are not able to legally discriminate and stop Black people from voting anymore, boom, we right back involved in the political system and gain tons political representation. Excuse me, between 1970 and 2006, the number of Black elected officials in the U.S. grew from 1,500 to 9,000, six-fold increase. 1971 being the largest year, impact of the Black freedom movement and Black political representation. Shirley Chisholm becomes the first Black woman in Congress in 1968. She also was the first woman, I believe, out of any color to run for presidency. There's a movie that just came out about Shirley. Shout out to Shirley. That's my auntie name. All right. Yeah, so identity, culture, connection, evolution of Black music. Like I said, it's kind of a similar story that we've already explored in unit 2 and 3, but in the and unit 4 actually already, because we just talked about the spirituals. So we just think about the evolution of Black music. This is topic 415 or so. It starts with the Negro spirituals. It goes to ragtime and the blues and then folk songs and then jazz and then R&B and then soul music and then hip hop and funk. And there's all these other different elements that's not in there, but it all goes back to improv and call and response and syncopation and dance. And all of this starts in Africa. All right, these are the customs of African people that we see in live action today. Everything that you see now, the way people dance, the way people make music, is all African inspired. So yeah. Then the next topic is about African Americans in STEM, which those of you who are my students or look on the wall in my room and see all the Black inventors that are all over the place. That played a significant role. Fields of agriculture, we definitely got to think about George Washington Carver. When we think about technology, medicine, and science and engineering, all of these different ways that, you've probably heard through many Black History Month programs and all these other things that, who are these people that are in these fields? Well, the essential knowledge in this course doesn't really explore the people, but it explores just the concept to know that there are people who making these contributions. Yeah, so one of the people in medicine, Daniel Hale Williams, who was the first open heart surgery who did the first open heart surgery. And then I know Charles Drew did the first blood bank. And in science, there's so many, but my favorite in science is Lewis Latimer, who helped out Thomas Alva Edison to create the carbon filament for the light bulb, even though Edison gets credit for the light bulb itself. And there's just many others. So African Americans supported this training for Black medical professionals, establishing medical schools at these colleges, and the National Medical Association for Black medical professionals. For National Medical Association, because Black medical professionals were initially barred from entry to the American Medical Association. So Black doctors weren't really allowed. And then thinking about all these other ways that, even an enslaved man brought awareness to vaccinate people for smallpox. And this is one that I learned recently because Kizzmekia Corbett, central to the development of the Moderna COVID vaccine. And that's pretty much the end of that part with Black people in STEM. One of the sources in there is one of my favorite people, which is an image of Mae Jemison. She's really awesome because she's born on October 17th, like me. So, or I'm like her. Shout out to Mae Jemison, though. She's on the wall in my room, too. Afrofuturism, moving on, a cultural, aesthetic, and political movement that blends Black experiences from the past with an Afrocentric vision of a technologically advanced future that includes data science, forecasting, and AI. There's no better example of this than the movie Black Panther and Wakanda itself, to kind of just think of a future where Black people are advanced technologically. Um, but there are other examples of it. I think we saw some of that in the New Orleans Museum of Art on a field trip that we went to on my class. But you can explore that as well on your own a little bit more if you have any questions about it. Um, Key takeaways, I think, is that's the last topic for it. Civil rights movement, long fight for equality that involved many different people from all backgrounds, not just Black people, but there was more and more white people involved and people from all backgrounds as well. And that's similar to abolitionists. It's another civil rights movement in a different century. Ultimately led to key changes in government, Brown versus Board of Education, elite made segregation illegal, Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Because of those things, people like us who have grown up after this took place have no real understanding of what it might have been like to live that way. We can read about it, we can think about it, but we'll never feel it. And it's because of all the work that took 100 plus years to do. All right, there was always a violent response from white citizens who pushed back against this Black progress. We saw that very, very vividly in each unit, and this one it was no different. Many different ideas, many people had different ideas about achieving equality, but uh throughout the diaspora, the end goal was the same, which was equality, which was freedom, which was liberty, which was justice for all. And I mean, obviously, the main people when you think about different ideas in the civil rights movement, it's definitely Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. But you think about the Black Panther Party, you think about Stokely Carmichael, you think about a lot of these more outspoken um or people who didn't choose the nonviolent strategy. Not saying that they were violent, that people always get that misconstrued that just because you're not nonviolent, that you are violent. You could just be a person who wants to defend yourself. And last but not least, regardless of how things went, Black people throughout the diaspora continue to advance forward in all aspects of life. And because of all of the sacrifices that were made during the times of Unit 2 and the times of Unit 3, uh in the 20th century, Black people are able to actually realize some of those goals and some of those dreams that their ancestors had. I'm sure everyone might have seen the t-shirts about I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams. Well, you very well might be. Most likely you are. And that goes for a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds, but for African Americans specifically, I feel like, because of all the things that we learned about from previous times, it just means that much more that you can't take it for granted. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to a close. I saw a few questions as I was going through the chat that I felt like I could have answered, but I'm not sure. Marsha, were you able to go through that and see all the silliness that my students were participating in?
For the most part, it was fine. Um, there was one question that I answered in the chat. That was actually one of my students who asked that. And then there was another one that another student answered. So, you know, if people have any remaining questions, you can ask it. If you have something that we didn't go over, that you would like more clarification on.
Did you answer the
Um,
question about the veil?
yeah,
Okay, okay, cool. Other than that, I think I really enjoy watching students answer each other's questions. It's pretty cool. Glad you
yes.
guys are getting along.
All right. I don't see any questions in the chat, so this is going to be a last call for any topic, person, event, test taking strategies.
It's taking strategies. Look, I've been out for 2 days, these last 2 days, so I know we missed some stuff. So if y'all got some questions, you know, ask them now because we ain't gonna have a lot of time tomorrow.
There was a question to me if I'm going to have an after school review session. No, but I'm definitely going to be encouraging people to watch this video. But this is pretty much it. I've done, I feel like I've done, I feel like the review assignments that I gave were pretty comprehensive. Um, but there was a question to clarify about the veil. Um, so what I basically said in the chat about the veil is that W.E.B. Du Bois basically says that like African Americans have this veil on them that is it's kind of doing a few different things. It's preventing people from seeing them as they really are because of all of the like anti-Black racism that exists in society. Like that prevents people from, it's like something that's blocking them. Like if you think of like a literal veil, it's like something that's, over your face. So it's preventing people from really seeing and treating people, African Americans, as actual people and as full Americans. So, one of the things that he talks about in the Souls of Black focus about how you know, African Americans don't really belong in America, but they don't really belong in Africa either. And so it's that veil that is preventing people from really seeing them as fully part of American society. But it's also something that prevents African Americans from truly seeing themselves as they are without that racism. He says like, is something along the lines of like always thinking of themselves in terms of how others see them.
Right.
So there's that aspect as well that all of this anti-Black racism has just clouded everybody's perceptions of Black people, and that has had tremendous impacts on how they're treated in society, but then also like psychologically. And then he goes into like that double consciousness, like that it's the veil that like kind of causes the double consciousness like situation. Um,
Yeah.
if you want to add anything to that explanation.
Basically, I mean, I was just kind of nodding my head because the double consciousness, there's the one consciousness when the veil is covering your face and you're out in society. But then there's the other consciousness when you lift the veil, when you're at home in the comfort of your own place, when you're just around Black people who all think the same way as you, and the way you see the world with them and the way they see the world when you're just amongst yourselves. But obviously the dominant society, when you leave the house, you're a part of that now. So you can't walk outside your house without your veil on because they're not gonna see you for who you are. If you try to be yourself, you're really risking your life. So you have to wear it in order to protect yourself.
And that's why that topic is paired with We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar.
Correct.
So you can basically, if you understand We Wear the Mask, then you understand double consciousness. Like they're basically saying
Hmm.
the same thing, but
Exactly.
just slightly differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of my students, Rhea, was asking about diasporic solidarity, which like I was trying to break it down, but just to think about it like this. If African Americans, Latin Americans are all part of the diaspora, are Afro-Europeans as well. If we are all in all these different places and we say, all right, those people are not the same as me because they are from Europe, or I'm not the same as African. I don't want to have any connection with the country of Africa or people in Africa or the struggles that they might be enduring or any kind of cultural aspects of their life. I want to disconnect completely from them. That would not be solidarity, right? So the solidarity that came about during the 20th century was African Americans seeing the struggle of Africans with colonialism and then fighting for their independence and becoming countries of their own. Malcolm X traveled to Africa during this time. Martin Luther King did. W.B. Du Bois, Maya Angelou. A group of them went over there to see what was going on, and they were welcomed with open arms, as opposed to what Malcolm X said in his writing. And this is me going into my own deeper studies, was that he had been told that Africans had no relationship. They didn't care about Americans. They weren't going to treat us right. And I still hear this in conversations today. Oh man, you go to Africa, Africans don't love us, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's not really the case, and it never really was. It was just what the mainstream media kind of told everyone. But uh when that African independence movement really started in the 50s and 60s, African Americans, specifically the prominent leaders, went to visit and they saw something totally different than what they were thinking. And it really brought them closer together. And if you think about African Americans in the Caribbean, um, or Africans in the Caribbean, I should say, Afro-Caribbean people, there has always been a connection between Haiti and Louisiana, for example. The German Coast uprising happens right after the Haitian Revolution. That's diasporic solidarity even back in the day. But for Unit 4, is really mostly connected to the civil rights movement as well as the African independence movement against colonialism from European countries. So if you want to think about it, when you want to think about diasporic solidarity, you'll see it as a part of Unit 4. So connect the civil rights movement to the African independence movement, and then you'll probably be in the right area. But it's a connection that exists through when you just break down the words themselves, which is when we talk about test taking strategies, we're just looking at vocabulary right there. We know what the diaspora is, so we know what diasporic should mean from that. And then solidarity, solid, sticking together, holding it down. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, so there was a question about who the big six were. I mean, this is one of those things where like you don't necessarily have to remember
All
like
six of them?
yeah. I mean, you just have to
Yeah, no,
understand
probably
that
not.
there were like these leaders of the major civil rights organizations. So like Martin Luther
Right.
King's one of them. He's the, leader of the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There's like A. Philip Randolph. There's John Lewis, who's leader of SNCC. There's like Whitney Young, who's like National Urban League. Like James Farmer, I think, is in there. And who's the NAACP person?
Roy
Roy
Wilkins.
Wilkins. Yeah, so you just kind of have to understand that like these leaders were all working together. And even though they had slightly different focuses for their groups or maybe slightly different strategies, that they were all working towards like the same goals pretty much. So that's really like the big concept that you have to understand there.
Right. And I think they're all of them agree that nonviolence was the best strategy. And there were no women in the Big Six either. So all of the leadership was male. And I think that kind of leads into another part of it. And Bayard Rustin it gets left out of a lot of these conversations because he's a gay male. So that's all in the central knowledge. So when we think about the Big Six, you don't have to name them all, but you might want to at least know the organizations and why it was important to note that these were all males. We are having a study. I am going to stay after class tomorrow, so 4 o'clock. So who's ever staying in my class, I'll be there. Oh, there's a question about the Congo before they were converted to Catholicism. Oh, I forget actually. I did know it. I didn't. I haven't revisited that information, Aubrey. I'm sure there was some worship of nature. I'm looking at Demaya's response to that, something like that.
Yeah, like some sort of polytheistic belief system.
Yep.
Um, okay, so for there's some FRQ questions, or FRQ related questions. So there are 4 FRQs, and
Yep.
each FRQ has 4 or 5 parts. So A, B, C, D, or one of them probably will have like a part E. I don't know, maybe. I don't know if they kept that feature. Last year, that's how it was. One of them had 5 parts and most of them had 4. And then you have 70 minutes, 7-0, to complete all 4. So it averages out to about 17 and a half minutes per FRQ. And within the um, test like program within Blue Book, I believe you can go back and forth like between different answers. So like let's say you're you look at the first one and you're like, well, I'm not really sure. So then you can go to the next one and see what the question is. And you're like, okay, well, I can answer this one. So then you answer that one. And then you can go back to the first one and answer that. And it saves what you've written. So, you know, because there's a time limit, you want to get as many points as you can. So, personally, I've been recommending that you answer what you can answer well and you put your effort into that, make sure you get those points, and then you use the remaining time to go back and write something for the others. And I want to emphasize that AP tests, there's no penalty for guessing. There's no penalty for wrong answers. So think about what do you think the question's asking you? What specific information can you throw out there and explain in response to that question? Just go for it because it might work. Um, if you say something wrong, it's ignored. Um, you know, so it just means that you don't get points if you're wrong. So you should just try to be as specific as possible. Also, one thing that I haven't necessarily emphasized enough, but because like they give you, A, B, C, D, they give you them all at once, and then they just give you a text box to write your response. It's better to say A and then write your answer, B,
Hmm.
write your answer. That way it's clear what you're trying to do, like what part you're trying to answer. It also keeps you organized and on task. It also helps if you like kind of write out the beginning of the question, as a complete sentence so that it keeps you focused on what you're actually supposed to say. So that's just sort of like test taking like strategies and protocol. I graded FRQs last year and you know, students did all sorts of things. You don't have to label each part. You can just write it as one big block of text, but it does help keep you focused if you are doing each part individually.
And I think that's our time for definitely mine. I gotta get to bed. Uh, but I appreciate y'all showing up. It does at least show that y'all are dedicated and trying your best to put your best foot forward and knock this exam out. I hope that this was helpful in some kind of ways. We'll get back to it tomorrow, and then on Tuesday is game day. So I'm excited. I'm hyped. I want to put my best foot forward. So that's why we're doing this too, to do everything I can to say I did my best to prepare you. Um, I appreciate y'all for showing up. Miss Greco, thank you for holding it down as usual. So I wish you and your students the best of luck as well. I know that y'all gonna do great.
Yes, well, thank you everyone for being here or who are watching this later. Um, and I wish everyone the best of luck. So have a great night, everybody.